Okay, so welcome everyone. This morning we are joined by Simon Pooley and Stephen Dodsworth to talk about nature conservation and particularly thinking about the role of people and communities within that. So this is the second webinar in our Breakfast with Birkbeck series. There is a recording of the first webinar if anyone wants to go and visit it and see that if you missed it. And we will be recording today's discussion as well to produce another webinar. So I think first of all, we will turn over to Simon and Stephen for some introductions. So Simon, do you want to start us off by telling us a little bit about who you are, what you teach, what you do, all these things?
Sure, thanks. So I'm the Lambert Lecturer in Environment, Applied Herpetology. It's a slightly eccentric field. I work on human-wildlife interactions, and in particular, I work on crocodiles, crocodilians around the world. Plenty of them. 26 are recognized at the moment. About 8 of them tend to be problematic characters. But we interact with these animals in many different ways, positive and negative. I work as a conservationist through the International Union for the Conservation of Nature on the Crocodile Specialist Group and the Human-Wildlife Conflict and Coexistence Specialist Group. So I'm an interdisciplinary researcher. I have backgrounds in humanities, social sciences, and I work a lot with sort of data now and natural science colleagues on my work. What else? I work also, I'm from South Africa and I'm an honorary researcher still at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Locally here, I say locally, I'm sitting in London. I work with the Zoological Society of London, just been advising them on how to avoid having their cheetah eaten by crocodiles in Zambia, which was fun, and except if you're a cheetah. And I'm doing archival work with them on their sort of histories of the people who have helped them around the world, but whose stories are generally not told, so we're recovering those. I'm also a program director of Birkbeck's MSc program in environment and sustainability, and I lecture on environmental topics to undergraduate and graduate students, including on my global nature conservation module. Like that's enough.
Super, thanks, Simon. And Stephen, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you do and what you're teaching?
Oh, so yeah, good morning, everyone. So I'm a lecturer in plant science at Birkbeck. So I've just started at Birkbeck a couple of months ago, so quite fresh to the university. So I'm a botanist, really, of various description. So what that means really is that I'm obsessed with plants, which you can probably tell from my messy background of plants attacking me. So at Birkbeck, really one of the main things that I will be doing is developing our new BSc in environmental science. And as part of that, teaching specifically about plants and perhaps a bit more broadly about environment within that program. So we need to, to understand the environments, you really need to understand vegetation, and to understand that, you need to know what a plant is, how to identify it, and how they're critical, how they adapt to environmental conditions, how they interact with other organisms. So these are the kind of things that I'll be mostly teaching. From also from my kind of research perspective, I guess overall I'm interested in plant diversity. So the numbers of different plants that we have, why we have so many, what is it, what kind of traits, what kind of adaptations do they have? So some of my research is kind of pure ecology. So, going out and looking, identifying, counting things, seeing how things change over time. But a lot of it is also molecular based, so using DNA methods in particular to understand evolutionary processes. Also, I'm very interested in the fundamental mechanisms that govern morphological evolution. So, for example, how does one flower change from one type to another? How does flower color change so rapidly? How does that interaction happen with pollinators and animal species, etc.? But yeah, I guess my overall interest is in that diversity of plant species and how do we have that diversity? How do we maintain that diversity? How is that changing over time? I also work a lot with people at Kew Gardens. I used to work at Kew. If anyone hasn't ever been to Kew Gardens, you should go. It's a fantastic place. And also a little bit as well with the Natural History Museum. And that's probably enough. I started rambling about plants already.
Plenty of time for rambling about plants, Stephen. You offered a lovely kind of link through to the first question I was going to ask when you mentioned plant diversity. It seems like biodiversity is one of those words that, you know, every discipline has their words that kind of means different or has a lot of different understandings of it. I wonder, could you tell us a little bit about what is biodiversity? How do we know when we've lost it if we're talking about biodiversity loss? How do you measure it in your field?
Very good question. So I guess maybe I'll begin with something from my perspective, and Simon will probably have a very different view. I do agree. So biodiversity is one of those words, one of those terms that gets now thrown around left, right, and centre. Yeah, it's kind of a buzzword, I suppose, but often it gets thrown around by people who've never studied it or are not quite sure what the word means, which is not necessarily a bad thing, right? If we're thinking about, you know, engaging the general public with these issues. So I always try to, especially when I'm teaching about the subject, to give a really broad definition. So it's really the variety, it's the entire totality and variety of life within some kind of area. That is then too vague, right? So people are like, well, what on earth are you talking about? But the reason is we can talk about the numbers of different species. We can talk about genetic diversity. We can talk about trait diversity, ecological function and ecological diversity. And all of those things I think are really encompassed within biodiversity. But so it is all encompassing, if you like, for me at least. But we often don't use it in that sense. In terms of how I interact with it most within my field, probably the single most common, if you like, more specific definition would be species richness, or the number of species. And that might be in an evolutionary context. So when you're thinking about, you know, why is one group more diverse than another, or in an ecological context, so why is one area more diverse than another? But of course, there are many other ways we can measure this diversity. So things like phylogenetic diversity. So if we build a tree of life, a tree of relationships between organisms, how closely related are they? How much of that breadth of the tree of life are we covering with whatever assemblage of organisms we have, and so on. So yeah, it's on the face of it, it's a very it's a good word, it's a good term. It's very simple, but actually I don't think it really is. Maybe Simon, you want to say say something?
I just had to turn off my camera because slow internet connection. But Simon, anything different from your perspective? How do you measure biodiversity in relation to the crocs and the cheetahs?
No, I would agree that it's a term that's useful, but is poorly understood. And so what I find when I teach on this is that initially I'd assumed a lot of things that people understood about species and taxonomy, and I realized that actually it isn't part of many people's education, surprisingly. So the Convention on Biological Diversity is the sort of formal statement for, at least for the purposes of conservation. So it's the variability among living organisms from all sources, terrestrial, marine, aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they're a part. So that's, as Steve was saying, it's diversity within a species, genetically, between species, so the different organisms, zebras and giraffes and and of the ecosystems that they are part of. So it's often sort of conventionally divided into those three kind of levels. So you've got genetic, organismal, and ecological diversity, and that might seem quite clear. And in practice, we tend, as Steve said, we tend to measure surrogates because it's so complex. The easiest is species. So we tend to go for species richness as a kind of surrogate for biodiversity, which is sort of helpful sometimes. But one of the reasons we've started to look at ecosystems is that we actually know a lot less about species than people think we do. We're still trying to figure out how many species there are. We, funnily enough, know an awful lot about our group, our taxonomic group. So we're super knowledgeable about mammals, and we kind of like birds because they're small and they make nice calls and they're colorful, and people like to have lists of them. But after that, we kind of fall off a cliff. So we really don't know plants. We're surprisingly rubbish. Insects is kind of hopeless. There's just so many. So we're learning still, and it's part of our work to learn how many species there are out there. And of course, genetics has complicated this because a bunch of things that we thought morphologically they look like the same species, it turns out they aren't. And I suppose before I boggle everyone's brains, the only other thing I'd really say is there are quite a lot of concepts of species. So it isn't just, people kind of assume, oh yeah, species, we know what species are. And it's the biological species concept. They're populations, groups of the same species that can breed together, but not with other populations. Yeah, that's great, except plants, except all sorts of things which don't reproduce that way. So there is a phylogenetic species concept. There's kind of two big families. There's a horrifying number of different concepts out there in play, but there's kind of two families. There's the biological species concept family, the phylogenetic, which is about descent from common ancestors sharing uniquely derived traits. I won't go any further into this, but the interest of this for conservation is that it really kind of matters which one you choose, because you're going to get different counts, literally. The biological species concept tends to lump species together, and the other one, the phylogenetic, tends towards splitting. So in crocodiles, you might have one dwarf crocodile biological species concept. In the phylogenetic, you've got 3 or 4. So you could imagine that when you're trying to decide how many species there are and also where they are, so that you can focus your conservation efforts, it really kind of matters which one you choose. So when I teach on this stuff, we do have to talk a little bit about species and the concepts, the families, and what we're actually counting, just so we know. We need to agree how we're using these concepts when we have conversations. And very briefly, there are various ways of counting biodiversity. And probably the one that you'll see the most sort of headline statistics from is the International Union for Conservation of Nature's Red List of Threatened Species. And that's an attempt to count all species in taxonomic groups and to rate their level of endangerment. Are they least concern or near threatened, or are they in the kind of threat category, which is vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered? And then, of course, the bad news ones are extinct or extinct in the wild. So they only survive in zoos, which is a bit of a sad place to end up. But there are various other approaches, also indices, which try to cope with the fact that we don't know how many species there are in some very big, important taxonomic groups. So there are ways of trying to using what we do know, make reasonable estimates of the status of some of those other taxonomic groups. But there are different kinds of ways of counting this. There are other indices which monitor particular populations of species around the world over time. There are things that look at biodiversity within particular areas. There are a whole lot of ways, and if you come and study with us, we'll talk them through. But I think that's enough probably for now.
Excellent. So I guess realizing that biodiversity means so many different things to different people, and accepting that, could you tell us a little bit about what causes biodiversity loss? Maybe some of the obvious things, but also I'm guessing there's less obvious things, less obvious drivers of biodiversity loss that you encounter as well. Stephen, do you want to start us off on that?
Sure. Just one final thing to pick up from what Simon was just saying, which I just glossed over entirely as someone who spends a lot of time defining and describing and thinking about speciation in plants. Plants don't behave. This is true, right? So they hybridize. They can have multiple sets of chromosomes. Just everything that animals typically don't do so much. So defining those species, defining those taxa, is actually a job in and of itself. So if you don't have that typical biological species concept barrier, it's another big thing to think about, as well as cryptic species and so on. So I guess for plants, really, habitat loss is still pretty much the number one cause of loss of biodiversity for plants, but that probably wouldn't surprise people so much, I guess. I guess wrapped up within that, there are multiple causes for that loss, right? So is it conversion to farming? Is it what is happening to those areas of let's say rainforest, for example, that are being lost? But there's also lots of other things that are becoming significant threats if I think more about plant species. So for example, harvesting of medicinal plants, which is becoming an increasing problem, and even things that you might not think about, but harvesting and over-harvesting, let's say, or illegal harvesting of wild collected plants for horticulture. So there are certain groups of plants in particular that are highly, highly desirable. Usually these are CITES listed species, so you have to have a lot of paperwork if you are trading them legally. So things like all of orchids, all of the cacti, and they're things that people around the world have, big, impressive, wonderful collections of, but that desirability, I guess, for that kind of, it's a very sort of traditional Victorian thing of collecting all of the plants of some particular thing. It's like an obsession, I would say. And this is a big problem. So with that and sort of harvesting for medicinal and other uses of plants, people probably wouldn't think about, because you'd think about, yes, bulldozers coming in or people coming and chopping down big swathes of forest or other natural vegetation, but you wouldn't think maybe about more sort of specific threats to individual species, I suppose.
Thanks, Stephen. Simon, what about in your field? What are some of the obvious and less obvious drivers of biodiversity loss?
So I think the big five, again, for animals, because I feel like I'm speaking for the animals today. I don't know who's doing the microbes. So habitat loss and degradation is the biggest kind of cause of biodiversity loss. Species overexploitation, so for animals, that's quite a lot of it. Fishes in particular, pollution, invasive species and diseases, and climate change. So those are the kind of big five. I think, you know, overall, just our sheer consumption of the Earth's resources is unsustainable. We exceeded the Earth's biocapacity to regenerate what we use within a year on the 1st of August this year. So we really are burning it up. And if you think, again, I know it's obvious, but we live on this one small planet, which is the only one we know of that has life at all, and that we have as an option, Elon Musk and Mars aside. And on that planet, we have 29% of that is land. Mostly we're ocean. 71% of that, 29% we can actually live on. And half of that is farmed to feed us. And so I think 77% of that is for animals. This vast area that we have given to grow animals for us to eat. And the fact that we're kind of polluting this tiny available area, our sea and the air we breathe, that we're using up the trees and the forests and the fish, we're spreading diseases and invasive plants around. Like there's diseases like the influenza, avian influenza, killing our birds. Of course, we've seen crossovers from animal diseases to us, as we quite possibly did in COVID. We spread diseases that have killed very significant trees here in the UK, the ashes and the elm trees. We're changing the climate in the way that's going to make things very difficult for us and other living things. And this is, of course, is bonkers. That's a technical term. And it kind of can seem overwhelming, but I think we can do quite a lot, especially in a high consumption country like the UK, where we import so much stuff from elsewhere. If we can begin to understand the links between what we're doing here and the sort of quite severe environmental damages associated with our consumption that are happening in far away natural environments that we don't see at the other end of complicated supply chains. So eating soy through the animals we eat, or in many other ways, has led to the destruction of rainforests in the Amazon. And since rainforests got more kind of popular as a cause, this has just moved into the Cerrado savanna. Palm oil, I mean, who knows what palm oil is in? I mean, it's in lipstick, it's in instant noodles, it's in pizza dough, it's in ice cream, it's in things we don't know it's in. Consumption of that has led to, you know, cutting down of the last of important areas of Bornean rainforest. The orangutans live nowhere else on Earth except there. So stuff we're doing here is buying lipstick and pizza can be causing existential problems for significant species and environments on the other side of the planet. Buying mobile phones, the computers we're using to talk to each other, those minerals they come from places where the mining of them causes human misery, but also quite severe environmental destruction. I'm thinking of the Congo Basin, the other green lung of the planet, the one we hear much less about in DRC. I've written a book recently on the okapi and its only environment of this incredibly rare animal, the national animal of the DRC, of the Democratic Republic of Congo, is in this area which is being mined and exploited. Things like AI, you know, we think that they're ineffable. They somehow don't impact on the Earth because they, in the clouds, have huge energy impacts on the planet. So I think part of what we try and do here is to kind of teach people a little bit more about the linkages between what we're doing and those kind of far off places. It's just too easy to sort of point the finger at some guy chopping a tree down in Ecuador. But the reason that's going on is because of our consumption here. And there are ways of doing this now. There are a bunch of platforms like Trace or Chatham House have a resource trade platform now. There's the Global Forest Watch. You know, we have masses of data now, but it's very hard to, none of us has the time, and most of us don't have the skills to try and interpret it and make the links, but there are people doing that. So we can start to make better decisions. So one thing I was gonna see, as Steve would say it, but with climate change, we hear a lot of advocacy for tree planting. It's the answer for carbon capture. It's green. Actually, in many parts of the world, we shouldn't be planting trees. So please don't support tree planting. So this is one of the unusual ones. You know, if people are now thinking, wouldn't it be a great idea to, you know, feel less guilty and buy some credits so we can pollute some more because they'll plant a whole bunch of trees in Mozambique. If they're planting them in a grassland or a savanna, and we're putting in plantations of introduced trees, that's a terrible idea for biodiversity. So please, yeah, please don't do that. So perhaps that's one of the more unusual ones.
Yeah, I think we had a student a few years ago who did a project on tree planting, and you know, the takeaway message was that the kind of tree and where it's going is, you know, hugely important, unsurprisingly. But thank you for that. I feel like you've kind of both given us this overview of how, you know, the impacts of all of this cross over all scales, from community right up to planetary. And I guess thinking about that, thinking about how these problems affect such a wide range of people, you might expect that communities would be really eager to be involved in conservation efforts. But as you said, sometimes the project isn't a good fit, or sometimes there might be problems. Can you talk a little bit, Simon, about the challenges that might arise with getting participation from communities in conservation projects? And I guess this could be communities who are at the, you know, living in the habitat that is being destroyed, or as you pointed out, communities that are further along the supply chain but benefiting still from those practices.
Sure. I think one thing I always like to say at the beginning when we're talking about communities and conservation, which is hugely important as we try and move away from a kind of colonial, top-down, more dictatorial style, is that when we talk about involving communities in conservation efforts, we need to sort of unpack who's involving who in what. So we need to acknowledge first that there are many communities around the world who are doing a pretty good job of protecting their own land, the land that they need, that they live on, that they've been living sustainably on for a long time. So interventions by external conservationists can help or can get in the way, can actually hinder what they're doing. So in my area of human-wildlife interactions, we need to kind of figure out, is there already human-wildlife coexistence in this place? And if there is, if people have figured out a way to share a landscape with difficult animals who feed on their livestock or their crops, or even on them, then let's not intervene. I mean, let's not interfere. Let's just figure out, really, I suppose, more how we can support this, and that might be through helping them deal with powerful institutions like, I don't know, transnational companies or unsympathetic governments. Perhaps that's something we could add. And of course, there are situations where locals are quite hostile to conservation aims, and that doesn't necessarily mean they don't care about the environment, but they might have difficult histories where conservationists have come in and arrested them or kicked them out of, disallowed them access to natural resources. So they're kind of legacies, unfortunately, of conservation, of interference related to conservation, which have had negative impacts on people, on their cultures, on their livelihoods. So we need to think through what's going on in a context before we get involved in you know, trying to influence communities to do things we want to do as conservationists, because we're just one sort of set of people who want things to happen in a landscape. And, you know, in my own work with crocodiles, if you want animals like crocodiles to survive in a landscape, you have to acknowledge the damage that they can do. And sometimes it's not appropriate for people to be sharing a place with particular species or particular individuals of that species. You know, the problem with national parks and protected areas that for many indigenous people, they have been associated with dispossession and displacement. So I would say in conservation, it's only since the 1990s that we've really begun to recognize the rights and contributions of indigenous people. And to add to the list of formal protected areas, we also have now what we call conserved areas, which are conserved by local communities. We also have sites with other effective area-based conservation measures. So those might be sacred forests or those kinds of areas, which also brings up this interesting link between cultural diversity and biological diversity. There seems to be some very strong overlaps between those things, what we talk about when we talk about nature cultures. But if there certainly are conflicts and difficult challenges where people are sharing landscapes, like with big herbivores that eat their crops, like elephants, or in East Africa, sharing a landscape with lions if you keep cattle, which many people do. And then if you want those wild animals to persist, it's essential to work with communities to persuade them that it's worth keeping these animals in these places. I mean, after all, these people are living there. So, you know, if you don't persuade them, most conservationists are visiting, and these locals are just, it's their backyard. They can work around, they can undermine, they can simply outlast your conservation project. So one of the things we do in my nature conservation module is we survey the kind of range of things that conservationists use to try and influence and work with communities. So it's regulations, it's incentives, so like PAIR schemes, payment for ecosystem services schemes, direct compensation for damage, insurance schemes. We try and change behavior through offering alternative livelihoods, which is a complicated thing to do. Education. There's a whole lot of things which all have their own kind of pros and cons. I think really the things that work are those interventions where we involve people, communities from the beginning in the vision for what should happen, and then the how we're going to do it, and then the how we're going to monitor how it's going and evaluate it, share the information, agree on whether it's working or not, or whether it needs to change, admit the impacts, address the costs. I'll just give one example of this. An interesting program has been the Lion Guardians in East Africa, Amboseli Tsavo landscapes, and they decided, so conservationists were concerned that Maasai people who keep cattle were killing lions, and they figured out that the people who usually do that are the Moran, the young male, the warrior caste, if you like, and it's part of their role is to protect their communities, and part of that is to kill lions that kill cattle. So instead of fighting against this cultural role, they instead worked with the Morans to give them skills. A lot of these guys were illiterate, didn't have a lot of skills, so they worked with them to become lion guardians, where they were still protecting their communities through tracking, through telemetry. They tracked the lions, they learned how to track them. Each guy had an association with a particular lion, and they kind of developed a relationship with the lion as well, because they have respect for lions. Just because they kill lions doesn't, it doesn't imply they dislike lions and don't admire them. They found a way, they found a very successful program. So these guys know where the lions are, they can warn their community, they can frighten the lions away, and they also help protect the lions. So that's an example of where working with the community, I think, has been very successful. The program now is working in other places. There's Long Shields in Zimbabwe. So there are examples where this can work. The Philippine crocodile, the Mabuaya program in the Philippines has been another intervention where working with people has really helped the species and given people reasons and pride to share a landscape with difficult animals.
Thanks, Simon. That's fascinating. It seems like, finding those points of connection seems to be, the really important step. Stephen, in your, your teaching, your outreach work, what have you found are the kind of key ingredients or the key steps in getting communities, getting people, getting students interested about these issues and excited about these issues?
That's a big question. I guess for me, one thing that I think about a lot in my teaching, outreach, research work is the fact that people don't really acknowledge plants, let's say, and in fact, even more so than that, the fact that people don't even see plants. So I'm sure some of you are aware there's this term of plant awareness disparity, and the fact that it's something going on in our minds as we walk out amongst nature or in an urban environment. We just simply don't see the plants that are there, and I think this is exactly. So this was what's called plant blindness. It's still called that term to some, but it has changed slightly. So I guess really what I'm thinking about is why is that the case, and also what is happening. We talk a lot, at least in botany, we talk about the extinction of botany, the extinction of people who can identify plants, who understand plants, who can study the taxonomy of plants and can really relate to that in nature. The number of younger people who can go out and identify, even with a common name, not necessarily a scientific name, five species that are outside. If we stepped outside Birkbeck into Torrington Square, it's quite bleak, in fairness. Maybe we'll go to Gordon Square, so we're a bit further. But who can identify even a handful of species that we've got there? So I think something is going wrong, possibly within the UK context, definitely through the education system, where we're just losing interest. And I think one thing we can do, one thing I try to do as well explicitly, is to inspire people by looking at the diversity of plants that we have. So, if you ask them, well, what's the largest flower? You can come up with all sorts of guesses. Oh, have you seen that massive flowering plant that flowers, every 7 years or so, and it smells like rotting flesh? What? Have you seen Rafflesias? These parasitic plants. These are the world's largest flowers, right? They're like a big giant pizza, and they look like flesh, and they stink like flesh, and they attract flies as pollinators. These are fascinating, giant, giant pitcher traps, carnivorous plants. Plants that typically don't move, not like an animal, and that's a problem. But some plants do move. They have really fast movements, like the sensitive plant that quickly, folds all its leaves together, or a Venus flytrap that kids are always fascinated by. So I think sort of using, if you like, that diversity of traits, the diversity of species, how wonderful they look, they smell, even when it's a bad smell or a scary look. Some are terrifying to look at, just aesthetically. But to get people interested in plants from that perspective, and then to notice what's around you. If you throw a quadrat square like people do at school, onto a school playing field of mown grass, there's probably 20 species there, but people will just say grass because it's boring, right? It just all looks the same. It's not, and it's not really representative of a natural habitat. So yeah, I think for me, thinking about what we do in terms of training, in terms of education, in terms of awareness, in terms of outreach more broadly, is kind of critical. Because otherwise, yeah, we're on a downward slope if we just accept that people don't care, and I don't think that's true. There was one really interesting thing I did want to say. So I was at a symposium last week at the Royal Horticultural Society. So they're PhD students that are twinned with different universities across the country, and there's a really interesting study here about species richness, so number of species of plants, perception of that, and well-being. And well-being was measured here in how quickly and effectively you relaxed after a stressful incident. And I think it was like a foghorn or something, a horrible alarm, something that's a very quick stress response. And the thing I found fascinating from this as a take home is there were some clear relationships here, but it wasn't with how diverse. So we had these different virtual environments with different numbers of species arranged in different ways, and there was no relationship at all with actual diversity. But there was a strong correlation between perceived diversity and that person's well-being or their recovery after stress. So it really, a lot of this is how we perceive and how we understand the natural environment. So if we think, for whatever reason, this group over here with 5 plants is more interesting, is more noticeable to us, is more relatable. Actually, that's a lot of what I think it is to do with, are there plants we recognize? Do we recognize that as soothing? Is there an association there with something that someone gave us at a point in our life, or something that grows in our garden? That's more important than there being 10 species, double the number over here, but you've never seen any of those plants before. You've never eaten any of them. You've never grown them. So yeah, I thought that was a very fascinating point. I'm rambling again about plants. I'll stop at this point.
Amazing. Thank you, Stephen. I feel like if this is the ethos of the new environmental science program, it's going to be a good one. I think we're going to leave it there and take some questions, but thank you so much to Stephen and Simon for giving their time and sharing their expertise today. I certainly have learned a lot.